This is episode 108 of the Trauma Coaching for Latter-day Saints podcast, The Phases of Trauma Response. I'm your host, Danita Bremer. I'm a Latter-day Saint mom with a history of trauma. I use my own life experience and spiritual gifts, as well as mindset and somatic tools to help you trade ashes for beauty and end generational trauma. Let's talk about what it takes to truly heal and find lasting joy from the perspective of your nervous systems. All right. Are you guys all ready for Christmas? That's okay if you're not. I'm not either. And we have almost a whole week left. So finish your Christmas shopping, wrap all those gifts, put them under the tree, and then put your feet up and grab some hot chocolate and sit in front of the tree with the lights off and the tree lights on, looking out your window and just enjoy the holiday. I wanted to answer a question that I get very often, which is how do you know when something is trauma, especially when an emotional response is trauma versus just an intense emotional response? So, the answer to that question is to explain the phases of trauma response so that you can understand what needs to happen in order for something to turn into trauma, for a situation, for an emotional reaction to turn into trauma. Okay. So, the very first step or phase of the trauma response is the startle. And I will also put a picture of this sort of flow chart in the show notes so that you can kind of have something to refer to if this is helpful for you. So, the startle is what triggers us to go into a defensive orienting posture. There are two types of orienting, two types as far as I know so far. There's curious orienting, which we do when we feel safe. We can walk into a room, or I just think of like when you walk into a museum, right? And there's so much to see, and you're just like looking around, going very slow, like I'm totally safe and I can explore, right? The second type of orienting is defensive orienting. We orient defensively when there is a possible perceived threat. Defensive orienting is like what little bunnies do when they see you coming down the path. They freeze and they stare right at you, right? Your neck is stiff and your body is rigid. And you sometimes, depending on the situation, you go investigate still what is the perceived threat so that you know whether you should run away or fight or, how to respond. The startle is the trigger for an active response, for that fight or flee response. So if we get startled, so say you are home alone and you're in your office or you're in your bedroom and you hear a clatter that sounds like it's coming from the kitchen. You might like all of a sudden get kind of rigid and be like, what was that? And then slowly go investigate, right? Now, if you walk into the kitchen and it's just one of your cookie sheets that was on the counter drying fell over, and you're like, oh, okay. No, there's not some intruder in my house. I don't need to like get the baseball bat and be ready to fight, right? So if you have the startle and then you investigate based off of your defensive orienting posture, and it turns out to be nothing, then you kind of come out of, you have like a downward slope from this sort of stress response, right? It's like a get ready for the stress response. So if there's no real threat, then we just come out of it. We kind of go, oh, that scared me. And we come down from the startle, right? So that would not cause any kind of trauma. But if we are startled and then we defensively orient and we investigate or notice an actual threat or a perceived threat, because that's really important with trauma. It doesn't have to be an actual threat, it could just be a perceived threat. And it's real, right? Like, oh, there is a stranger in my kitchen. Or, for example, if you hear a loud pop outside And you're like, was that a car backfiring? And you look out the window and there's a guy walking down the street with a gun, right? Then you go into fight or flight. Okay. So if the threat is perceived to be real or is a real threat, then you go into the active response. So the active response is the fight or flight. And also remember that most of us, most of the time, never experience quote unquote real threats, like real life threatening situations, like a lion is chasing us, or a guy is walking down the street with a gun, or a car is veering into our lane. Now, we do occasionally, these are all situations that somebody has experienced. But in our day to day lives, most of the time, the threats are actually perceived through our emotional response. It's like, oh, I'm afraid. It might not be like my life is threatened, but it could just be like, I'm afraid that my daughter will miss her flight coming home for Christmas, right? So our world has evolved such that we don't have a lot of life threatening threats, but that doesn't mean we don't perceive threats, right? So I just kind of wanted to take that tangent for a second. So, active response is phase 2. When the startle shows us that there's a threat that we should be aware of, we try to run away. And if that running away doesn't work, and our nervous systems make these perceptive decisions in split seconds, right? This is far below our level of conscious thinking. It's a subconscious, like an intuitive, like a gut reaction or an instinct, right? If we perceive that we're not going to be able to run away, then we might try to fight, right? That very common phrase, fight or flight. So that's the active response. And the purpose of that is to get us to safety, to be able to survive the threat. So in real life, because we don't often have, life-threatening situations coming at us. Now, some of us do. So I just want to honor that. But by and large, most people that are probably listening to this podcast aren't feeling like their life is at stake most of the time. And if you do, then come talk to me or a therapist or something, get some help, please. But I wanted to put out just or an example. So in motherhood, we can't run away from the threat because oftentimes the threat is our own child, right? Our own child is like seeming to create some anxiety in us or something, right? And so we can't run. So we fight it, quote unquote, fight it. And that's where so many of us, and this was totally me, go to yelling and angry outbursts, right? If you find yourself always frustrated, yelling, kind of like fighting, not like physically punching or hitting, that kind of thing, but in sort of a internal fight feeling, it might be because your nervous system perceives that you can't get away from the threat, right? So instead, we're going to fight it. And if we can't run away and we can't fight and no help is available, because another option here is yelling for help, right? Then our nervous system basically perceives that our active response is not going to work. And so we go into a freeze. Now, what triggers the freeze is a thwarted response. Thwarted response is phase 3. And what I mean by thwarted response is anything that stops the active response, anything that stops us from running or fighting or calling for help. So this could be internal or it could be external. So if we think of like a really stereotypical example of you're walking down the street and then a scary person comes at you and you start to run away, but they tackle you and they wrap their arms around you and they're bigger and stronger than you. So you can't fight and you can't run. That is a thwarted response, right? Like you tried to run away, maybe you try to fight, but you can't. And so instead, what will likely happen is that you will just go into like, okay, I'll do whatever you want, right? So the thwarted response is the trigger for the freeze response. Okay. And we go into a freeze response for our own safety and survival. Sometimes you might hear people who maybe got attacked somehow, and you ask, well, why didn't you fight? And maybe they said, well, I tried to fight, but then I couldn't, right? This is why. Because if the threat is bigger and stronger than us and we can't run away, then it can hurt us more, or it can lead to faster death if we try to fight, right? I just think of like that example of somebody trying to like wrap their arms around me, and I'm a small person and I'm not very strong. If I try to keep kicking and like hitting, I might actually hurt myself more, right? And so phase 4 of the trauma response is the freeze response. So in order for something to turn into trauma, in order for an emotional experience to turn into trauma, there has to be a thwarted response that leads to a freeze. The freeze response, which is the 4th phase, is there to conserve or collect energy. And in previous episodes, I've talked about the antelope or the gazelle running from the tiger or the lion. I can't remember what animals it was. And sometimes the predator, when the prey kind of goes into that freeze response, pretends that they're dead. It's not that they're pretending. It's not a conscious thing that happens. It just, the threat is completely overwhelming the system. And so you go into the freeze, which is a form of like dissociation. Sometimes the predator will actually drop the prey because they think the prey is dead. And so they'll drop the prey to go get their babies or whatever. And then if the prey isn't dead, that is an opportunity for them to get back up and run again. It happens all the time in the wild. So the freeze response happens when our nervous system perceives that we can't run, we can't fight, there is no help. So let's conserve energy, let's collect energy and wait, right? And there are a couple of sort of signs that you're in this freeze response. There's an altered state. So if you kind of just feel foggy minded, maybe you kind of like bump into things a lot, you just don't fully feel like yourself, that could be a freeze response. I recently had a coaching call with a client where she had a very charged conversation with her husband that put her into a freeze response. And the next day, she said like she ordered some Christmas gifts online. And then she went back and she was like, wait, I didn't order the right one. And what am I doing? And everything she did was sort of like a near miss, right? And my brain went to like altered state, this sort of like fuzzy headed feeling, kind of like you're going through the motions, but it's not really landing, right? And the fawn response or automatic obedience is a part of the freeze response. So, my episode on the fawn response, this is sort of an addendum to that. You might find yourself just going along, automatic obedience, right? Just sort of make them happy, whatever the threat is, especially if the threat is another person, because sometimes a threat is a situation, right? It doesn't have to be another person. But in order to protect yourself, you just go along with whatever the threat tells you to do. And I think this is so fascinating because when we think about sexual assault, sometimes the victim of the sexual assault is blamed because they might not have said no, right? They might not have actually used that word. But if we think about it from the perspective of the nervous system, if you're in this freeze response and you're in this sort of fawn or automatic obedience, then that means that the no, like saying no, is actually not even available at that point, right? So maybe somebody says no, or no, I don't want to, whatever. And then they perceive that they can't run away, they can't fight. I just have to go along with what this person is wanting me to do in order to survive this, in order to be hurt less. Once we enter that freeze response, the no is often not even available to us. So if you have ever been in a situation like this, either sexual abuse or something like that. It doesn't have to be sexual abuse, but some situation where you didn't feel like you could fight, you didn't feel like you could run, most likely you went into a freeze response and you might have just gone along, right? Because that was so adaptive and smart for your body. So please don't feel ashamed of this. This is often where people feel tremendous shame because they think that they had a choice when they really didn't. And then the third thing that can sort of signify a freeze response is body sensations. So when we go into the freeze response, we lose sensations. We might not even be able to describe how we feel, or maybe it feels kind of like numb, but even numb is kind of a feeling, right? But some version of I can't feel my body. And when we come out of the freeze response, we start gaining back those body sensations. So we might feel sore for no reason. Because remember, we've braced from that startled response, right? We've braced, and then all this energy went into our system in order for us to be able to run or fight. And then the brakes were put on that. That energy had to go somewhere. It goes into our cells, and our bodies actually like develop around it. And when we come out of the freeze response, if we ever come out of it, we might start feeling some soreness, some like kind of like when you work out one muscle group a lot and then you stop working it out, like there is sometimes like a different feeling there, right? Or if you were to go on a hike and you have a heavy backpack and then you get to your destination at the end of the hike and you put your backpack down, your muscles are kind of like, oh, right? That's when you feel the soreness and the tightness and all of that. So that's the body sensations. And right here, I wanted to talk about what happens when we get stuck between freeze response and active response. So some of us would say that we struggle with both anxiety and depression. How do I say this? You guys, I write an outline, but I don't script all of this out. So sometimes I stumble over my words a little bit. As we go from totally normal, everything is fine, to then startled and then run or fight, and then that doesn't work. So then we're in freeze. Freeze is kind of a shutdown, right? It's a way for our bodies to conserve energy. Well, as we come out of the freeze, whatever was there, the active response, the energy in our nervous system that was there that got too much, that was overwhelming, and that's why we went into the freeze response, is still there waiting for us, right? So we go into the freeze response because there is energy and activation and it's overwhelming. The threat overwhelms the body's systems, which is why we go into the freeze response. So when we come out of the freeze response, that activation is still there waiting for us. So it's possible for us to oscillate between the freeze response, which some people describe as like a depression, and an anxiety, right? Anxiety would be more of that gas pedal on all the way. And the freeze response is more of like brakes all the way. So when we come out of the freeze response, if we don't have the capacity to be with the activation, it'll throw us back into the freeze, right? And then as we conserve energy and we have time, our bodies will naturally want to come out of the freeze response. But if we haven't built in that capacity to be with the active response, then we'll just go back and forth between anxiety and depression, or I like to say activation and freeze, right? I feel like those terms are a little more neutral, and anxiety and depression are terms that are very loaded, right? So I like to encourage people to say, if they would normally say, oh, I'm feeling anxious, I like to encourage you to say, oh, I've got some activation. I have some energy in my body. That is a really important point, right? That we can oscillate between this activation and this shutdown. And the reason why we do that is because as we come back into the activation, we don't have the capacity to be with that activation. And so then we shut down again and we never get back down to the place where we're just like, oh, I'm safe. Everything is good. Right. So in the freeze response, what we really need is resources, especially heat, because remember, this is a biological process and the cells of our body are getting more rigid. Just like when water freezes, the um not the cells, because water doesn't have cells, but the molecules themselves are vibrating less, they are moving less, right? So our cells are moving less, they're less supple and like able to move, right? They're more rigid. And so actually using heat, whether that's a sauna or a hot tub or just layers of blankets or a heating pad or soup or warm drinks, any form of heat will help the freeze response. And the other thing is we need to slowly come out of that freeze response. We need to do it little by little. That's how we grow that capacity. And especially with the aid of a practitioner, right, who knows what they're doing in relation to trauma. That's why hiring a therapist or a coach or somebody that can co-regulate with you and can slow this process down, because our brains are going to want to go faster. We want it I just want to be done. I just want to be out of the freeze response, right? Our brains are going to say like, let's just hurry up and get this done. But that is exactly the opposite of what we need. We need to go way slower, in my experience, so slow that it's almost frustrating, and slowly build the capacity to be with the activation that is in your body. And sometimes you don't even know it's there. Like when I was working with a coach, and I'm sure I will again in the future, sometimes I'd be like, I don't know, I don't feel like I'm feeling anything. And it was just because my skill at noticing what was in my body wasn't very developed. And also because I'm coming out of a freeze. So remember, in the freeze, we have less ability to touch into the sensations in our bodies, right? So that's why really slow time is such an amazing resource, and heat, right? So just a gentle caring for ourselves is what we need. And then the last phase of the trauma response is self repair. So it's possible to be in a chronic freeze. This is typically called the functional freeze, where the core of us is sort of frozen and rigid and always on edge, but we're functioning on top of it, right? And the picture that always comes to my mind is the idea of the stream near my house. We have this green belt right at the end of our street, and there's a little stream that runs through the green belt. And in the winter, like right now, you go down to the stream and it's half frozen over, like most of it is frozen over, but underneath there's the water is still flowing, right? There's a flow. And so it's kind of opposite, because I think in our bodies, the freeze is sort of the core, the freeze is the underneath. And then on top, there's a flow. So we can still kind of go about our day to day lives, but we're always feeling like we're rigid, we're tense, we always have tightness in our bodies. At least this has been my experience. And it's really hard to relax, right? Because that relaxing is actually, to truly relax, we have to go from the freeze down through the activation and back to our window of tolerance, that place in our nervous system where it's just kind of like, oh, like, and here's another example of when we go for a run, we don't just start sprinting, right? We kind of warm up our bodies, because we know that if we just start sprinting, we're going to pull a muscle, right? We kind of have to warm things up. And then when we're done with our run, we don't just plunk down, at least most runners don't that I know of. We sort of go from running to slowing down to then walking and then just maybe pacing, right? Like I just think of watching the Olympics and those runners that do the sprint. At the end, they're just sort of pacing around, right? And so we go up into the stress response and then we come down out of it. And that coming down out of it, that is the part of our nervous system that's sort of our window of tolerance. It's the part that slows us down. That's like, okay, we can rest now. We can, you know, just slow down and be and enjoy the moment. Well, for those of us who have kind of a chronic freeze response, that is never available to us, right? Because we haven't come out of the freeze down into the activation and into the window of tolerance. I hope that makes sense. So please let me know, email me if any of this doesn't make sense or if you have questions. Danita@danitabrummer.com. So the last phase of the trauma response is self-repair. When we come out of an active response. So let's kind of back up into phase 2, which is the active response, which is where you run or you fight. Let's just say that you actually were able to run away or fight off the threat. If that were to happen, then you would slowly come down and be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. Oh, you might go to somebody and you might tell them about it. You might, call your husband or text a friend and say, you won't believe what happened. And the process of talking about what just happened is partly how we process it, how we kind of come down out of that active response, right? So if we're able to go into the active response and then come down out of that active response, it doesn't turn into trauma most of the time, right? Most of the time, it doesn't turn into trauma. Trauma happens when we have that thwarted response, when the active response is stopped, and then we go into freeze. And then it, like the famous Bessel van der Kolk book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? The energy from the active response goes into our bodies, into our cells, and gets sort of trapped in there, which it's basically unresolved, right? So one of the definitions of trauma is an unresolved autonomic nervous system response. The autonomic nervous system is the nervous system that's perceiving threats. It's the part of our nervous system that says we should run, we should yell for help, we should fight, or we should freeze, right? So when it's unresolved, when we can't come down easily out of that response, that's when it qualifies for as trauma, right? And as we work with someone or even on our own, slowly learn to thaw from the freeze response, that's part of the self repair, right? Coming out of the stress response, integrating the situation, understanding it, being able to be with it. But ultimately, what we want is to come back to our window of tolerance, back to a felt sense of safety, not a logical knowing that we're safe, but a feeling in our body that we're safe, which is why for years and years, even though I had the dreamy husband, we had we had money in the bank account, we had the house in the suburbs, running cars, nobody was having any kind of health problems. Like on the outside, my life looked great, but on the inside of my body, I still felt like I was in that constant, like watching out for dangers. I did not feel safe. So that self repair gets us to a place where we feel safe in our bodies, right? Okay, so those are the 5 phases of trauma response. Let's just recap. The first one is the startle response. The second phase is active response, where we run or fight. The third phase is a thwarted response, where our fighting or our running is stopped. The fourth phase is the freeze response, where we conserve or collect energy, where we just go along in order to keep ourselves from getting more hurt. The fifth phase is the self repair, coming back to a felt sense of safety. So, why is this important to know? Well, first of all, back to what I said at the beginning, it helps us differentiate between true trauma and just an emotionally charged situation. But every body is different. So, for me, if I were to look at you and say, oh, that wasn't trauma, it was just an emotionally charged situation, I don't actually know that unless I ask you some questions about, did you feel like there was something inside of you stopping you or something outside of you stopping you? Do you feel like you're kind of frozen, right? So each body is different. And just like if we were to, I always think of like the analogy of a car. If a car has half a tank of gas, then it has fewer resources than a car that has a full tank of gas. And when we go to like step on the gas or brake real hard, right, that takes a lot of gas to go back and forth between the gas pedal and the brake pedal, it's going to use more gas. So that car that only has a half a gallon in the tank, going to run out of energy way faster. So part of this is to recognize that the energy required to go into an active response is different for each person, and the energy they have in their reserves is different. So some people might go from active response to freeze because they don't have the resources to start out with, right? So that's a part of this equation as well. And everybody is different, like literally every body, not everybody, just every individual body has different amount of resources. And so we can't really tell when something is trauma for someone unless we start asking questions about their experience and how they feel, right? So that's a really important thing to know when we're talking about, well, what is actually trauma and what's just an emotionally charged situation, right? I have the opinion that everybody has some kind of trauma that they're carrying just because we're all gone through life, right? We've all probably had some situation where we went into active response, thwarted, freeze response, right? So that's just interesting to know. And then the second thing why this is important to know is so that you can start tracking your own nervous system, so that you can start touching in, checking in with yourself and being like, hey, am I in an active response right here? Am I in a shutdown? Am I in a window of tolerance? Am I in that place where everything is good and I can just kind of be and I don't feel on edge, right? In my experience, because I have been in a functional freeze most of my life, not that I know this, I have had such a hard time being able to relax. I could literally go on vacation to Hawaii, and I have 4 times, and I still don't always feel like I can relax. It's always like I have to be watching out for something. And it's not my mind, it's literally my body, my bodily experience, right? Okay, so journal questions. There are several for this episode. As you can tell, this episode is much more packed. And so there's several questions. The first question is, in what situations in your life right now do you feel startled, on edge, or like you're bracing yourself? Because here's another distinction with trauma. It's not about the past. Trauma is about what is showing up in your body right now. We don't have to go back and talk about the past. We don't have to bring up the memories. What we do is we work with what is happening in the body. Sometimes the memories come up, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you can just literally work with the sensations in the body and get so much relief. But it's helpful to know and to think about your life right now and what situations, maybe times of day or people you're around, that you feel on edge or like you're bracing yourself. And for some of you, it might be as soon as I wake up, that's how I feel. Question number 2, are there memories that you associate with these feelings? I personally like to, once I identify the situations and the feelings, I like to think about, is there somewhere this came from? If you don't want to, you can totally skip this question. Because for some people, going back, trudging up the memories is, they don't want to do that. And that's totally fine. But for me, I find that if I think, oh, yeah, that was just like the time when my dad yelled at me because of blah, 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 right? It helps me kind of connect the dots of like, oh, it makes sense that I feel this way. Even if it's not logical, it makes sense because my mind, my nervous system is associating it with another time in which I felt really unsafe. Question number 3 is, where in your life do you externally or internally feel thwarted? For example, you want to say something, but you stay quiet instead, or you want to do something, but you don't, right? Those are the two sort of broad categories of, is there something that you just want to say? Maybe you just want to scream, but you don't allow yourself to. Do you notice anything in your life right now where you feel thwarted, where you feel that sort of like, oh, I can't do it? Question number 4, is there an ever present tension or rigidity in your body? And do you have a sense of why? And maybe you don't have a sense of why. And maybe you just think about, what types of situations make me feel tense or rigid? All right. So those are the journaling questions. I wanted to let you know that I am, and I've mentioned this a couple times in the last couple episodes, about a group coaching next year. And I just want to tell you a little more about it. Before I do that, though, I just want to say I have 2 private coaching spots left. And I am offering those at my current rates. And when those 2 spots are left, my rates go up. So if you've been thinking about wanting to hire me, or just you're curious about what it would be like, I really encourage you to get on a free call, totally free. The reason I do that is because the work that I do with trauma, it's so important that you feel safe with whoever you're working with. And so I like to do a free call. You get a little taste of what it's like to work with me, and you get to kind of try on, does working with Danita, does that feel safe? Do I feel like I could open up to her? Do I feel like she cares about me and wants the best for me? And sometimes the answer is no, for no reason or nothing that I might do or say. Sometimes it might just be, you remind me of that girl from middle school who used to bully me. Right. So that's a really important thing, that you feel safe, right? We're talking about trauma response and threats and safety and all of that. And so if after a free session, you feel good, you feel safe, then, and you still want to investigate working with me, then we would go to a consult where we would talk about logistics and pricing and all of that. Now, it's the week before Christmas. I get it. We're all busy. I do have a few hours left on my calendar. So, and I have, I think, 2 or 3 consultations this week. So if you're interested, now is the time. I'm about to be fully booked with my private coaching. Now, if you know that you don't want private coaching, that's totally fine. I am doing a group next year. It's going to launch February 1st. And it's going to be amazing. I keep thinking about it and just being like, oh my gosh, this is going to be so fun. What I want this group to be, the name of it's going to be Presence. And I want it to be a hands-on, like filled with tools and tips that you can practice in the sessions with the group. And then you can take into your life and put them into use, right? So I don't want it to be where we all show up and one person gets coached and everybody else is listening. That's sort of a typical group coaching situation. We will show up and somebody will volunteer to be coached and I will coach them. But when needed, I will say, okay, let's talk about this. And we'll go into breakout rooms, we'll practice, we'll have somatic exercises, we'll do meditations. Like, I really want this group to be a hands-on experience where you feel like you are practicing things that you can then take into your life when you're not in the group. You could be like, oh, this is the time for me to practice this. I'm going to try this with my husband, with my kids, with whoever. The idea is that when we practice presence, being with our emotional experience, being with our bodies in a group that is safe, where we can get co-regulation from the other people. I'm going to have an episode about co-regulation. That will bring up the obstacles to being present. And oftentimes, trauma is one of the obstacles. Not always, there are other obstacles as well. But the way I'm thinking about it right now is, as you grow your capacity to be present, you will grow your nervous system regulation. It's just kind of the two go hand in hand. So I'm super excited about the group. I am going to drop a link in the show notes and in the description of this episode where you can sign up to get more information. It's just an interest list. There's no, signing up for the group quite yet. Although I will have on when you sign up for the interest list, it will take you to a page that will tell you about some bonuses, some fun early sign up bonuses, some friends and family bonuses or bonus. I haven't quite decided all of that, but I will decide before this episode goes out so that that information will be there ready and waiting for you. That's enough for now, and so are you. The impact I'm making in the world grows best by word of mouth. Would you please share this episode with someone this week? And if you're ready to address your own trauma with my support, go to danitabremmer.com to schedule a free trauma assessment call. Until next time, go be yourself and follow the spirit.